Hello BookTube, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over my June mid-month wrap-up. I've been reading quite a lot in June, so I decided to split up this month's wrap-up into two wrap-ups so that it's not like January where it's like a 40-minute video. So to get started, I'm going to go over my reading statistics for June so far. I'm only going to go over my genre breakdown and formatting, not my average rating, because I'm gonna save that until the end of the month. So first, going over genre breakdown. So far in June, I have read 11 books. Of those 11 books, 2 were romance, 2 were adult fantasy graphic novels, 1 was a YA memoir, 1 was a middle grade contemporary, 1 was a manga, 1 was a thriller, 1 was a YA romance graphic novel, and 2 were literary fiction. The format that I read these books in: 2 were ebooks, 6 were physical copies, although 4 of those were checked out from the library, and I listened to 3 audiobooks. Now on to the books that I actually read. So to start off June, I read Love from Mecca to Medina by S.K. Ali, and I actually read a e-arc of this. Thank you to Simon & Schuster Publishing for sending me an e-arc in exchange for an honest review. This book comes out on October 18th, and I'm so excited because this has been one of my most anticipated releases of 2022. I am so happy to see these characters again and to hear a little bit more about their story, as well as some of the characters from S.K. Ali's Misfits series, which I read for the first time along with rereading Love from A to Z back in April for Ramadan. This was kind of the perfect timing to pick up this book, and I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to read it as an early reviewer. This story starts off with Adam and Zainab in their 20s. They are kind of struggling with balancing their lives both as individuals but also as a couple, and that was actually one of the most relatable things for me when reading this book, is that I definitely understood their struggles, especially Zainab's struggling with this work and life balance, these feelings of failure, and also constant comparison, and never really knowing when to prioritize yourself. I became really emotional with this book. Both of these characters really impacted me in this story. I feel like also they have grown so much since the first book. They felt like more mature people whose worldviews have changed, and I loved seeing that progression. I also really enjoyed the side characters in this one. I felt like they were very well rounded and really added to the story instead of were just kind of on the sidelines. However, my favorite part of this story is how unapologetically Muslim this story is. I think that S.K. Ali does a great job of making Islamic practices that are a central part of this book very accessible for, in my opinion, readers of all faith. However, there is still a special significance to Muslim readers in this very spiritual journey that these two characters are going on, and how it not only brings them together but also brings their whole group together in the sense of community that is a very big part of this faith. I really loved how S.K. Ali included a wide variety of characters on this journey. I think that she does an excellent job of showing Muslims from all walks of life, including a representation of converts or reverts to Islam, and I love that. I felt very seen by that, and this was just a story that for me had so much personal significance. I definitely love this one. I cannot wait for my physical copy that I pre-ordered to arrive in the fall, because it's definitely going on my favorite shelf. 5 out of 5 stars for me. Really loved this book. Now I'm going to talk about the next 2 books together, even though I read them at different points in the month. They are a part of the same series, and a lot of my thoughts on them are interconnected by the fact that they are volumes 4 and 5 in a series. These are volumes 4 and 5 of the Rat Queen series. Volume 4 is called High Fantasies. Volume 5 is The Colossal Magic Nothing. Both are written by Kurtis J. Wiebe with illustrations by Owen Gieni. So Owen Gieni is actually a new illustrator that was brought into this series after a series of dramatic events that unfolded behind the scenes. I don't know that I have enough information on the series to comment on that series of events. I just know there was some shady stuff going on, and Owen Gieni was brought in, and I believe he continued illustrations until volume 8, which is the end of the series technically, because it's currently on hiatus. So a new illustrator is brought in. I did appreciate Owen Gieni's art style in terms of scenery and certain detail in specific drawing aspects. However, I felt there was a big issue with the depictions of the main characters, specifically Violet and Hannah, who look so remarkably different in this that I honestly didn't understand that they were the same characters from like the previous installment. Especially Hannah, she looked extremely different facially in this volume, and that's really jarring, especially when I really liked the previous art style of this. Now I understand that's obviously not guaranteed to remain throughout, but it was just a bit disappointing. And then while the illustrator of this series did change, the author did not. And so I find it very difficult to understand how Volume 4 makes sense in this series. So Volume 3 has this pretty substantial storyline that ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. Things are kind of in shambles. Volume 4 is about something completely different, and while I enjoyed the storyline in Volume 4, it doesn't make sense as a cohesive storyline with the overarching canon of the series. I did see that the author had posted an update on Goodreads that Volume 5 would explain how Volumes 3 and 4 were a part of the canon. And I'm sorry, but I have to call this bluff because after reading Volume 5, it still doesn't make sense. Volume 3 is explained in Volume 5. Volume 4 still isn't, and I don't fully understand how Volume 4 is supposed to be tying into this story or the point of its existence with what we find out in Volume 5. And Volume 5 also just didn't make sense to me as a cohesive storyline. It jumps around a lot. It feels like more of split scenes than this overarching story. I was so confused in it that I just didn't really understand why this was the chosen way to explain this storyline, when I feel like Volume 3 could have had an alternate ending that would have made Volume 4 canon, made it make sense, and Volume 5 could have just carried on with that. I feel like this might have been where the author was a bit too ambitious and didn't have the actual writing or plot construction skills to set up this story in the way that it needed to be to successfully craft this storyline. And you know, there's still 3 volumes after Volume 5, but I just feel like Volume 5 really completely ruined my interest in this series. Yeah, I won't be continuing on with this series. Volume 4 I gave 3 stars, Volume 5 I gave 1 star, and this will be the end of my Rat Queens era. Next, I listened to the audiobook of All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, which was narrated by the author. This is a memoir about the author's time growing up as a queer Black person and just kind of their experiences that shaped them. In terms of this story, the memoir aspects was so insightful and impactful, and I feel like this is a story where so many people could take something away from this in terms of a new perspective, a new understanding. I love that this is marketed towards a young adult audience. I think not only is this story accessible and appropriate for that age group, but also that this gives an opportunity for especially LGBTQ plus youth to see their stories reflected and to understand that their stories are their own to tell. I think this could also serve as a real starting point for members of the LGBTQ plus community who are younger to, have conversations with their family and friends through this book. However, as an adult reader, there were some aspects of this story structurally that didn't really work for me. I think it was a bit hard to follow in terms of a timeline of events, because there are certain parts of the story where the author jumps around in time a lot. There was actually this whole story that I thought was about the death of a family member that is actually not about that, and I still don't know for sure if that family member died or not, because we kind of get dragged into like a tangent that never comes back to the way the story started. So that was a bit confusing for me. That's also not the only example of that in this story. I also felt there were times where the author was drawing these somewhat superficial connections to major world events and ignoring more intimate personal connections between like the dynamics of certain family members and friends. One example of this I can think of is that the author discusses how their father had children from a previous marriage that they were not raised with or very close to. The author only discusses one of the siblings in a very specific context and kind of writes off the other siblings as, well, we weren't raised together. But I felt like there was a complete lack of nuance for the ways that their relationship might have been different because of the relationship with the father and how that affected their ability to really connect with one another. Yeah, I don't know. There were just certain aspects like that where I do have to question if, maybe the author didn't realize that this could have been impactful for them, or if it was that they hadn't fully processed, that aspect, because that's always a risk with a memoir. I do still think that this was a worthwhile memoir to read and something that certainly enlightened me to another person's experiences. And yeah, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Amal Unbound by Aisha Saeed. This is a middle grade contemporary about a girl named Amal. She lives in this more rural village in Pakistan, and one day she offends this corrupt local landlord, and in order to make up for this, she is sent to work in his family home and is exposed to kind of the broader picture of injustices in her village. And I don't know why, but I've been in a really big middle grade mood, and this definitely hit the spot for me. This is a story that had a good balance of accessible language and important themes such as class, poverty, and education. This story did have a sugar-coated ending. Things felt a little too simplistically wrapped up for me, but I can understand why for a younger reader, the ending that was chosen works a lot better for them than a much more intricate and heavier discussion about some of the implications of things that are revealed. I really enjoyed my reading experience of this one. I gave it a 4 to 5 stars. Next, I read The Mothers by Brit Bennett. I also listened to the audiobook of this by Adenrele. I mainly listened to the audiobook, but also read a physical copy. This is a story about a young girl named Nadia who she gets an abortion in a very small Southern California town that is pretty religious. The boyfriend who impregnates her, his name is Luke. He is the pastor's son, and he was this like local football star who went off to college, had a really bad injury, and his career is basically ruined and he has to come back home. He becomes kind of this washed up townie. We follow Nadia and Luke as this secret abortion between them affects the course of their lives. And we also follow Nadia's best friend Aubrey, who becomes kind of interwoven into this story through a series of events. And I was pleasantly surprised by this one. I haven't heard as much discussion about the mothers in comparison to The Vanishing Half, and I didn't really know what to expect from this story. I really loved Nadia as a character. I think I really related to her frustrations with growing up in a small town and not wanting to end up stuck there, but also feeling this pull back once you're finally out to deal with these like family obligations. I think she was an incredibly well-rounded character, and I will say that the main characters in this as well as the side characters are all really well-rounded. Also, the point of view from the mothers, which is a more ambiguous title, this point of view really added to the atmosphere of this story. I felt like not only do the mothers like fill you in on the local gossip, but they show their impressions of different people because they're learning the same things as you from local gossip. That added to this small town tight-knit community. Something that also really stuck out to me in this story is that Brit Bennett's writing reminded me a lot of Toni Morrison, especially this story reminded me a lot of Sula, with this small town tension and this sense of everyone knows everyone, but is that a good thing or a bad thing in terms of collective memory? And the writing also had that similar inviting atmosphere that really pulls you into the story, and it makes it really difficult to be taken out of the story because of that writing. So I think that might be my biggest takeaway from this, is that I really love Brit Bennett's writing style. However, I truly hated Luke as a character. He might be my least favorite literary character I've read from. He just very much had this victim complex that even when he tried to get his life together, it never fully went away, and I felt like he's always excused for his behavior. He never actually faces accountability or responsibility for his own choices in life. I found that very frustrating because I don't really understand what the point of his character was in this narrative besides to be infuriating. That really hindered my understanding of his character because I just felt, what was the point? Now, it wasn't just my deep-seated hatred of Luke that caused an issue for me with this story. I do feel like there were a few times in the story where the narrative is very disjointed. I think a part of this is to do with the mother's point of view. While I found it interesting, there were some times where it didn't fully make sense to me why it was being included in the story. This was especially a problem for me when like there's the revelation about the mothers in the end of the story, and I was just kind of like, okay, that's not really an answer. It's very ambiguous, and I needed more development from that storyline to understand what this was supposed to symbolize in the grand scheme of things, because as it sits, I don't fully understand why it was included. Overall, I will say that this was still a very enjoyable read that covers a lot of important themes, and I think this would be honestly a really good book club pick because the perspective that Brit Bennett shares in this story is so eye-opening, and you're very much left to your own interpretation of things, and I like that aspect to this because I think that it could lead to different interpretations of how to understand the story. And so I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5 stars. It's one I would still highly recommend. Next, I read Phantom of the Idol Volume 1 by Hijiki Isoflavone. And this is a manga that is about a J-pop star named Yu who's in a duo called Zings, and he thought his duo partner would be doing all the work and he would just be able to kind of pass on by, but this is proving to not be the case. After a very heated argument with his agent who threatens to drop him, the answer to all his problems quite literally appears before him. And this is Asani, who is a ghost who was also a J-pop star who tragically died about I think a year before the events of this book, and she is determined to help you kind of rise to the top as long as she can possess his body every now and then. This was a really fun story. I really liked the inclusion of J-pop elements in this, and also in the translator's note there is a discussion about J-pop terms and their descriptions, as well as an explanation of certain cultural aspects of this story, and I really loved that. I think it made this very accessible. I think this was a fun, lighthearted read. I kind of wanted a little bit more development of Yu as a character. I didn't really fully understand why he was so unmotivated. Also, there's this kind of switch halfway through the story to this like fan service storyline that I didn't think was necessary. I think there needed to be more focus on tying some of these scenes together. We were constantly jumping ahead instead of this more natural progression of the story. So having said all of that, I was convinced for most of this story that this was going to be a 3-star read for me. And then the ending came and threw a whole plot twist into this story, and it literally left me itching for the next volume. It adds this whole new context to this story that we've been presented with, and we're kind of now aware that something has been excluded from this story that is really important to understand Asani and Asani's role within this storyline. Yeah, really excited for the next volume. I ended up rating this one a 4 to 5 stars. Next, I listened to an audiobook of The Kimono Tattoo by Rebecca Copeland. This was narrated by Theresa Bakken. So this is a thriller about a translator named Ruth who has spent most of her life in Japan. And she works as a translator for this literary agent, and she one day receives this manuscript that is not from the company she works for. It's from a random person who claims that this manuscript is from a much beloved author who years ago was banished from his family and is presumed dead. So she gets this manuscript and she starts reading through it, and she starts to realize that the story is revealing these crimes that are taking place, and she starts to question, who is the author? Are they the one committing these crimes? And why has she been chosen to read this manuscript? So I received an arc of this from Brother Mockingbird Press via NetGalley in exchange for an honest review. And I was really itching for a thriller, so I was really interested in reading this. And this was kind of a wild trip. First, what I liked about this story, the descriptions of Kyoto and also of Japanese culture, and particularly sociocultural interactions, were really interesting and well written. I felt like the author did a good job of balancing out things so that it didn't feel like an info dump, especially when talking about the significance of the kimono in this story and also in Japanese culture in general. The writing overall I did enjoy. I think that it had a good structure to it. My issues with this were more in the content of the story. I felt like the story was just a little too convenient, and the most convenient part of this for me is the big reveal that we get, which never fully made sense to me outside of the very limited explanation we're given. Also, we're given like this big twist relatively early on in the story. Like it was, I think, around like 60% of the way through, and I kept expecting another twist to happen, but it didn't. And there was a point where I was still reading and I was like, okay, but what's the point of this? Because we already know all of these elements are like a part of this story. It was kind of drawn out after this big reveal. As for the characters, I wasn't a big fan of Ruth as a main character. She is somewhat like a passive bystander to certain things, and I think that led to this feeling of an emotional disconnect from her character. I did enjoy the side characters in this. I thought they were very well developed. However, there is a relationship that develops in this story that I had to roll my eyes at because the way it's included is so random, and it was one that I actually think I would have supported more had it been more naturally interwoven into the story rather than just thrown in at this random moment. Overall, this one just felt a little too underdeveloped for me, and there was a lot of suspension of belief for certain things, so I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Heartstopper Volume 2 by Alice Oseman. This is the follow-up to the first volume, which volumes 1 and 2 are what the show is based off of. I enjoyed this. I think that there are a lot of good conversations in this volume happening around identity. Also, we're introduced to some new characters that I enjoyed seeing. However, I will say that parts of this story definitely felt like it was recycled from the first volume, and I still felt like we didn't get a lot of character development from certain characters that I would like to see more from. I have heard that the first 2 volumes are, I believe, the weakest of the series. I'm still wanting to continue on with this, and I ended up giving this volume a 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon by Kimberly Lemming. This is the story of a girl named Cinnamon who one night is drunk and stumbling through a forest and finds this demon who is named Fallon. Fallon is not supposed to be in her kingdom because Cinnamon's kingdom is supposedly protected by this goddess who keeps all the demons out from hurting the people. Well, Fallon explains to Cinnamon that things are not as they seem with the goddess, and the goddess might not actually be protecting the people, but more so protecting herself. So Cinnamon agrees to help Fallon kind of overthrow this goddess, and they go on this grand adventure together. And this is my first self-published book that I think I've ever read, but oh my god, what an amazing book to start with, because I loved this. This was so well written, the characters were so well developed, and I felt like the storyline in this rivaled some fantasy books that have like 500-page storylines, and this one was less than 200 pages. It was so good. I was so intrigued with the story. It was very fast-paced. I loved our main characters in this, but I also felt like the side characters were really well-rounded. Also love how humor is used in this story. There were so many lines in this that had me laughing out loud, but there are also some heavier themes that are discussed in this story, and some really important ones regarding Cinnamon's like background with her family that I found really well done. Also, it is spicy. There is a lot of heat in this one, so just to be warned of that. I do feel like the romance was a little bit rushed, but it also still felt believable given the circumstances of this story. I cannot wait to read more from this author. I believe this is the first in a series, so I definitely will be continuing on with this series. I ended up giving this one a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to Guncle by Stephen Rowley, which is narrated by the author. This is a contemporary story about a man named Patrick, who is nicknamed in the story as Gup, which it means gay Uncle Patrick. He is taking in his niece Maisie and his nephew over the summer after their mother, who was Patrick's best friend, passed away, and Patrick's brother, who was their father, is going to a rehab center to deal with his own issues so that he can be his best self to take care of the kids. This story is very much about Patrick processing a loss that has happened before the start of this story that he's never fully gotten over, and also the kids processing what has happened to them as well as to Patrick with this loss of their mother. Something I really loved about this story is how funny it was. Yes, this is a story about grief, but grief is not a linear process. People process different emotions at different times, and you can still find joy and laughter and humor in a lot of events that unfold, and that is just as valid of a coping mechanism as other ways of processing grief. I also love Patrick as a character, and also this unique relationship that he has with these kids. I think it had an extra layer of significance for me because I am very close with my own nephew due to similar circumstances as those experienced in the book. And so I definitely related to this very precarious relationship that Patrick has with his niece and nephew, and navigating those dynamics as you have to help them through a very difficult time in their life, but also finding ways to process your own grief. I especially loved how Patrick handled some of these big questions that the kids had and approached certain more sensitive subjects with them. This was such a heartfelt story, and I can honestly see this being a really great film. My only complaints with this story were that I felt the author sometimes leaned a bit too heavily into these like life-changing monologue moments that felt a bit inauthentic in the story. And also there are these like minor plot points that seem like they're going to be huge and very impactful, but they're very contrived and very easily resolved. So I don't entirely think that those needed to be a part of the story. It just felt more for dramatic flair than anything else. And so I felt like those could have been excluded, and still this would have been a really great book. Overall, I rated it a 4 out of 5 stars. So those are all the books that I read in the first half of June. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you've read any of these books in the comments below, as I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. Thank you so much for watching. Happy reading. Bye.